In this video, we'll talk about why time and effort documentation is a required component of Office of Grants Management grants, when time and effort documentation is required, and how to document time and effort. What is a grant anyway? Grants are delivered in contracted agreements, but as opposed to a contract itself, a grant is a transfer of money to a recipient to accomplish a public purpose. With a contract, you tell the contractor more or less exactly what you want them to do for you. With a grant, you send the grantee money for a shared public purpose, and the grantee gets to determine how best to accomplish that goal. Contracts involve the transfer of money. They, more or less, enrich. Grants empower. With such empowerment comes responsibility. Organizations that receive grant funds accept the responsibility to spend those funds for the purpose with which they are given, to report on grant outcomes, and to practice careful accounting of the funds so that the public can see the return on their tax investment. OGM accepts the responsibility given to it by the state legislature to administer and monitor the grants. It has to check, through a financial reconciliation, that the grant was actually spent as the grantee reported it spent. OGM requires time and effort documentation for its grants. Good time and effort documentation serves two purposes. It helps you, the grantee, really know how much it costs to provide the staff time that it takes to run programs and build projects. And it helps OGM provide accurate data to the legislature and citizens about how public dollars were spent. The grantee must maintain records that accurately reflect the work performed. These records must be supported by a system of internal control, which provides reasonable assurance that the time being charged is accurate, allowable, and properly allocated. The records must be incorporated in the official records, such as payroll records, and reasonably reflect the employee's total activity. The records must tie back to the legacy grant's approved budget and comply with the grantee's pre-established accounting practices and procedures. As a grant recipient, you have options for documenting the staff time that you charge to OGM legacy grants. Direct time tracking, supported by a system that accounts for 100% of an employee's time. Or personnel activity reports, PARs, or the equivalent, that constitute after-the-fact determinations of grant activities and that account for 100% of an employee's time. Time tracking options are meant to give grant recipients maximum flexibility in meeting the minimum requirements of documenting time and effort charged to OGM legacy grants. Before we discuss options, what does it mean by accounting for 100% of an employee's time? By accounting for 100% of an employee's time, we mean accounting for all of the time that an employee works during the time period that the employee spends working on grant activities. We do not mean that grantees have to track or document every hour of an employee's time during the entire calendar year. When the grant is fully expended and the match, if any, is met, the requirement to document time ends too. Furthermore, we don't mean that a grantee has to describe in detail what other activities that employee is doing, besides those that the grant is paying for. Time not charged to the grant can be lumped into a catch-all other category. OGM asks for 100% of an employee's time while time is being charged to the grant, so that we can be sure a grantee's internal controls actually support the time they're charging. But more on that later. Now, what is the difference between the two time tracking options? Direct time tracking is the more robust option and recommended by OGM. Many organizations already have time tracking systems, spreadsheets, or databases that feed directly into their payroll systems. Time tracking is simply accounting for time, hour by hour, as it is spent on grant activities. Time must be tracked at both the grant and activity level. Not only the grant that you're charging the hours to, but also what you are doing on the grant during those hours. Personnel activity reports, or PARs, are meant to be the less time-consuming option. Using this option, at least twice a year, employees working on a grant itemize the time spent working on that grant in hours and sign the form. As with a direct time tracking system, time reported on a PAR must be itemized by grant and activity. There are a couple of fundamental principles to keep in mind about both of these options, direct time tracking and PARs. First, both systems have to agree with the grant recipient's system of internal control that provides reasonable assurance that the charges are accurate, allowable, and properly allocated. If you have a time tracking system, that itself is a system of internal control because it's comprehensive, it works across the entire organization, and it's consistent, the same for each employee in your organization. If you use PARs, internal control means that the PAR is backed up by an employee's own way of keeping track of time. That might be an employee's own spreadsheet or desktop calendar, or an online time tracking program. The PAR is a summary of the internal records that an employee maintains, such as an Outlook calendar, paper calendar, or other time tracking system. Second, both systems are after-the-fact determinations of the time charged to the grant. A fundamental principle of time and effort documentation is that it supports an actual number, not a budget number. This is why percentage allocations on position descriptions don't work for time and effort documentation. They project what an employee may or should do on a program or project funded by a grant, not what an employee actually did. Time and effort documentation can seem like a burden. However, in the end, these activities will provide the accountability that the state legislature and public demands. We hope they help you to better manage your grant-funded programs. We have had more than one grant recipient tell us that good time and effort documentation helps them to demonstrate to their stakeholders that their time is well spent.